Love helping your clients but hate sales and marketing, but somehow you ended up with sales and marketing responsibilities? Then this is the podcast for you. Hi, Chief Nerd Ruben Swartz here. I spent a long time learning these lessons the hard way, and I want to help you learn them the easy way by sharing my experiences and talking with brilliant people who have figured out how to hack not just the code, but the sales and marketing process as well. Of course, as a nerdy person who hated struggling with complex CRMs, I had to create my own CRM for people who actually hate selling, which sounds like an oxymoron, but if it sounds interesting to you, check it out at Mimiran.com. That's MIMIRAN.com. And whether or not you need a new CRM, you'll find proposal templates and sample lead magnets to help you grow your business. And this summer, we also got an awesome giveaway going on, signed books by amazing Sales for Nerds guests like Aaron Ross, Scott Ingram, Mara Thomas, Joy Beatty, Justin Foster, John Livesey, Vanessa Van Edwards, and Rusty Shelton. Plus, you'll get a free enrollment in my online course on sales proposals. Now, I do most of my reading on a Kindle, but there's something really nice about having a real book signed by the author in your hands. Register to win at salesfornerds.io and get more chances to win by referring your friends. Plus, with a bookshelf this big, you can share with your friends. You can't read them all at the same time anyway. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm really excited to have with me Oscar Trimboli. He is a speaker, an author, a mentor, and a listener from Sydney, Australia. And he wrote this wonderful book called Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. And it comes in this awesome little box that comes with its own set of, I don't know if I should call them playing cards, but there's sort of like activity cards that go along with the book. So it's not one of those things that you just read and put down and never come back to. Oscar, welcome to Sales for Nerds.
G'day, Ruben. I'm looking forward to speaking and listening to you today.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to hopefully do a good job listening. It'd be really embarrassing if I screw up the listening right now, but I'm a work in progress.
Please relax. Everybody says they get tense when they talk to me because they're worried about me judging their listening. I'm not. We're just two humans having a chat, mate.
There we go. All right. Well, that'll help. And my Coupe 2012 Syrah will help as well. Oscar is not a wine drinker. His wife and brother-in-law are huge wine drinkers, but he himself is the designated driver. So he will also be the designated driver on this podcast in case I'm not listening well.
Yeah. Well, which part of the world is that particular wine from, Ruben?
This is Santa Barbara County in California.
Oh, beautiful.
So it's kind of a fruity, velvety Syrah. I don't know. I end up drinking a lot of Pinot Noir, so I kind of wanted to mix things up a little bit.
Yeah, well, that part of California enjoys a very similar climate to the part of the world I'm from. So a lot of tree species as well as wine species in common.
All right. Good to know. Maybe there's got to be some way that I can figure out a good excuse to come visit.
We can figure that out by the end of this interview, I'm sure.
All right. Well, how did you get to be a deep listening expert? I feel like everyone should do a better job of listening, but many of us never really get that good at it, let alone write a book about it.
It was a series of events that kind of pointed me in this direction. I felt there was always a compass setting for me, but the GPS coordinates didn't lock in for a while. So I went to a school with 23 different nationalities. In the time I was at school, there were wars in Asia, there were wars in South America, and in Eastern Europe, the people were fleeing the Soviet Union at that time and coming to Australia. And my school was very near the immigration center where people get processed first. So the most likely school they come to is there. So we played a lot of card games, so I'm not good at math. In fact, I have this thing called dyscalculus, which means I transpose numbers, which isn't really good if you want to set off life in an accounting profession, which is what I did, but we'll get to that shortly. And I was good at reading body language, but I wasn't really good at counting cards. So no matter the fact that the South Americans were all speaking in Spanish, or the people from Southeast Asia were speaking Vietnamese in their teams of two as we were playing cards against them, their face always gave away what was in their hand. And I was really good at listening to their body language. And then in the workplace, my last job where I got paid a salary was as a marketing director in Microsoft. And a vice president once said to me during a very tense budget meeting between our Seattle headquarters, our Singapore regional headquarters, and our Sydney, Australia headquarters, wow, did you notice what you did at about the 23-minute mark in that meeting? And I said, no. She said, well, you'll need to wait behind because I need to debrief you on that. When a vice president says to you, you need to wait behind because I need to debrief you on that, it's kind of like your wife saying, we need to talk. It's not going to be a good outcome. But Tracy said something to me that kind of changed my life. and help the compass settings become GPS settings. Tracy said to me at the 23-minute mark, you took a very chaotic, conflict-filled meeting and brought it to a place through your listening and noticing that helped everybody get on the right track. If you could teach the world how to listen like that, you could change the world. And her request to me was, can you code that? And when she said code, now bear in mind I was at Microsoft, I said, do you mean code or do you mean code? And she said, no, I mean code. And that means put it into software. And I couldn't make any sense of that, Ruben. I didn't understand how that was possible. And then about 8 weeks later, our financial controller had a similar meeting where we were trying to allocate the sales quotas down to the subsidiary based on that meeting. And a similar dynamic happened just in reverse. We were head office and the sales team were trying to tell us why these sales quotas were absurd, ambitious, and completely unachievable. And a similar thing happened. I just asked the room to notice about two-thirds of the way into the meeting how everybody was and wasn't listening to each other. And then Brian, the CFO, said to me, you just completely changed the way that meeting outcome came about, and just because you were listening to everybody. And that set a path for me to go, maybe that's what I'm meant to do. And as I look back in life, and whether it was counting cards at school or working in a communications company at Vodafone, where I'd force marketing leaders and engineers to come into the contact center and listen to an hour of calls every month so they could understand the kind of language that customers were using, not the kind of marketing stories that we were telling the marketplace, or not the kind of products the engineers were developing, but just listening in the contact center, what the engineers noticed and the marketers. Wow, they're using completely different language to us. They're speaking in a completely different way. And getting people to just take the time to listen will move them dramatically on a productivity scale from kind of transactional to transformational. So that's kind of a really fast overview of my life of listening. And right now, I've set myself a quest, Ruben. I've set myself a quest to train 100 million deep listeners in the world before I leave the planet.
All right. Well, hopefully we're going to be bringing you a little bit closer to that total. I don't know if we're making a big dent, but hopefully we're going to get some people listening to this and transform the way they listen. As we were discussing earlier before we started, I feel like with all due respect, there's no rocket science or like groundbreaking biochemistry or anything in your book, but you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that all completely makes sense. Why didn't I think of that earlier? And one of the things that jumped out to me was how we all get taught to speak and write and basically push communication out there, but there's not really any formal education in listening, which seems at least as important. Why is that?
There's no listening literature for teachers to teach students. Parents are teaching their children how to listen every day through role modeling. And most of us spend a minimum of 55% of our day listening. And if you're in sales roles, you're in the 60 to 65% range. If you're in leadership roles, you're getting to 70% range. And if you're in executive roles, you're up to 80 to 85% of your day is spent listening. So I often say we spent the 20th century learning how to speak and to broadcast information. We need to spend the 21st century learning how to listen, because every communication is both speaking and listening. And although we spend half of our day listening, only 2% of the Earth's population is actually being taught how to listen. You use maths less than you use listening. You use English less than you use listening. You use science less than you use listening. Yet none of us have ever been taught how to listen. And the reason we think it's easy is because we don't know what good looks like. A really simple example of this is most people think that a good listener should be listening to the speaker first, and the first person you actually need to listen to is yourself and not the speaker, because if you've got a whole bunch of browsers open in your brain, and you're going to get distracted. And what you need to do is notice when you're coming into a conversation, are you even ready to listen? because most people are trying to listen while they've got a whole story playing in their brain. The story might be, I need to pick up my kids from school, I need to travel this evening, I need to prepare a meal, I need to put out the trash, somebody's coming over on the weekend. And in that moment, you're completely distracted. In fact, it's happening for you right now while you're listening to this podcast, whether you're driving, whether you're running, whether you're doing anything else while you're listening to this podcast, you're distracted. And if everybody simply understood that they would be distracted, they become much better listeners. And we'll talk about the neuroscience of listening shortly, Ruben, to help people understand why they're distracted.
Well, it's funny because you jumped into one of the most profound parts of the book for me, right? The 5 layers of meaning, and the first one being you yourself, not the other person. And I think we've all been frustrated when we're trying to communicate with someone else and we can tell they're not fully engaged with us. Every single person on the planet has had that infuriating experience. But how good are we at clearing our own mental plate before we start? And that was one of those things that I think you just phrased it so well, because I've learned over time that I need to chill out with my mind running 100 miles an hour. If I need to listen, I need to do it actively. But thanks to your book, there's almost like this meditative pause. Like, okay, I might have a million mental browser tabs open right now, but I'm going to pause and I'm just going to put them to the side for a second, because listening takes all of my processing, right? I can't be doing a bunch of other things and actually listening.
Yeah, and multitasking is a myth. I've had the opportunity to interview a number of neuroscientists from the US, from Germany, from the UK, from Australia. And one of the things we've been sold is that multitasking is this modern muscle that we've all need to develop. And it's a complete myth when you actually understand how your brain operates. It's impossible for you to have a focus on the thing that you need to do. And because we haven't been taught how to listen, most people find listening hard. Most people find it difficult to stay focused and be in attention for the moment they're in. I've got a database that I'm measuring people over a 3-year period of time, Ruben, 1,400 people. And what are the biggest barriers to their listening is one of the questions I ask them consistently. And it's not about the language the person's using. It's not about the context of the conversation. It's not about what they're trying to mean versus what they're trying to say. 86% of people struggle with distractions from electronic devices, distractions from their own mind, and distractions about something the speaker might be doing. So the most basic thing we need to do is just come present in the moment and be present in the conversation. And the simplest way to do that is just to breathe. You know, people ask me, if I've got to kind of break out into a yoga pose to get into a listening space. If you call on customers, which some of my day is spent doing, one of the things that's a very deliberate practice is the minute I step into the building, my cell phone goes into flight mode. And from the walk from the lobby to the lift to reception, I'm just connecting with my breathing. And nobody's noticing I'm doing that in the lift. Nobody thinks I'm breaking out into a yoga pose, but just centering myself with getting oxygen moving through the body and the brain and asking myself, what's my intention for what I do next? And then the minute I announce myself to reception, I want to make sure that I'm focused on that intention there. But most of us, if we're going on sales calls, we're checking the email, we're checking their email in the lift, we're trying to see what additional information we might be able to get on this customer or prospect. We're completely distracted going in, and we're not set up for success. One of the things I always ask at reception is they say, coffee, tea, water, and I always ask them for water for me, water for the person I'm meeting. Again, the water, getting them to drink water as well as me will slow them down and connect them to a place that's a place of focus, a place of intention, and a place of attention as well.
Well, right. And I wonder, maybe the wine slows people down even more.
Yeah, you joke, but in working with a lot of my clients, I often say to them, please stop talking like you just swallowed an MBA dictionary. Can you just talk to me like we're 3 wines down in a wine bar? Can you simplify that language? Can you make it a bit more human? And they always go, oh, yeah. And then they say what they actually mean. And I go, wasn't that easier? And they, oh, yeah, but I couldn't say that in front of my customer or in front of my boss or in front of it. I said, you would be surprised how welcoming they would be to simple language that means something.
Well, it's funny you say that, because when I started out, I think in school, you kind of get patted on the back for using a lot of fancy words. And then when I went off to college, the professor said, okay, we know you know these words, but please write in a way that's actually intelligible. Stop trying to use so many fancy words. And I got much better. Then I got into the workplace, and it was just like you said, all the MBAs were running around using all these crazy terms, leveraging their synchronicity of whatever. And I thought that's how you were supposed to talk in a corporate setting. And I got all the bad habits back and then some. And I remember I would have to explain to people what the heck I meant when I had written down, what I thought was a paragraph or a page or 10 pages of brilliance. And they would summarize it with those, 3 winds down type words. And it was really a very simple sentence to convey all this stuff that I had put all this gobbledygook in to try to convince everyone that I was smart. And if I had just been able to relax and say, here's what I really mean, everything would have been so much simpler.
And if you want a really quick way to shorten the sales cycle is speak in a language that everybody uses. And I always ask people, would you say that to a 7-year-old and would you say that to a 70-year-old? If you can simplify your language that it's as relevant to a 7-year-old as it is to a 70-year-old, then you're probably speaking the right way. And why does that matter? It means people can listen to what you're saying in a way that's effective rather than them trying to make sense of what you're saying. So, part of this discussion will be about how to listen better and make that more effective in a sales process. But the opposite is true as well. You need to ask yourself a question, am I speaking in a language that can be heard, or am I speaking in a language that's creating confusion? Because a confused buyer is a non-buyer.
That's a great point.
And a buyer that understands what you're saying in really simple language, can you make that into a picture? Can you make that into evidence? If you can speak to both the left and right side of the brain, you will be heard much faster. And if you can speak in metaphors, it's as simple as a compass setting and a GPS. That's an example of a metaphor. Then it makes sense immediately to the audience because they don't have to deconstruct your idea. They just need to locate your idea based on where this historical object, compass setting and GPS, is in their memory. And a lot of us who are technical and in technical sales, we're always selling the abstract. So one of the points you made earlier on, Ruben, is there's a set of playing cards. One of the most abstract topics you could speak about is listening, ironically. So the playing cards is to bring to life something that's intangible and make it as tangible as possible. That's why if you write a book on listening, that's handy. But if you really want to be useful, there's a set of 50 playing cards that you can use so you can practice once a week for the whole year to get better.
And I like how I didn't realize your story at the beginning of playing cards with folks whose language you didn't even share, but you've been playing cards for a very long time.
Yeah, don't tell my teachers.
Now, one thing that I think, I'm all for positivity and like, let's encourage good habits, but I think the 4 types of bad listeners are instructive. And if you could just talk about that real briefly, I feel like I have been in all of those buckets at various times and various moments. And I think people are going to recognize themselves sometimes in some of those bad habits.
Yeah. So listening is situational and relational. You'll listen differently to a doctor than you will to your parents. You'll listen differently to an accountant than you'll listen to a sibling. And the 4 villains of listening are in all of us, and they show up differently at different times. But we do have a dominant villain, a primary preference. So let's spend a bit of time with the dills of listening, the DILS, the dramatic listener, the interrupting listener, the lost listener, and the shrewd listener. The dramatic listener loves listening to you because all they're trying to figure out is how do they get the spotlight back on them. They're listening to their story that you're telling them so they can figure out how the spotlight comes back onto them. If you're going through a tough merger and acquisition, they're going to tell you about a time where theirs was harder. If you've got a tough boss, they're going to tell you why their boss was even tougher. If you're struggling with your quota and making your sales number, they're going to tell you about why they're struggling even more than you. And then the dramatic listener spends a lot of time in the past because that's where all their fabulous stories exist from. And they love the relationship, but they're not there really to listen. They're listening for coded words to make them sound a little bit more in the limelight, in the spotlight. They treat every discussion as a theatre setting, so the spotlight moves to them. And most people say to me this shows up most in familial relationships or friends-based relationships. The dramatic listener shows up there the most. The second kind of villain of listening is the interrupting listener. This is the most overt. This is the most common that other people identify as the kind of listening villain that really frustrates them. The minute you draw breath, that's their commercial break to jump in and give you not only their opinion, but the opinion you should have as well. Rather than taking a short 100, 2, 100, 3, 100 breath when you start to draw in breath to continue your idea, the interrupting listener is so wanting to make sure they help you that all they want to do is interrupt you. Now, the interrupting listener is also doing it from a helping place as well. They're genuinely interested. They just want to move the conversation along a little bit faster than they feel you're comfortable with because they're busy or their idea will shortcut everything we're going to do. So those two listening types are what I would call the overt and the explicit listeners. They talk a lot while they're listening. Now let's talk about the other two listening types, which talk less but are not necessarily listening anymore. The next listening villain is the lost listener. They're lost in their own thoughts. They're not even sure why they're in this meeting. You were kind enough to invite them, but they're not sure what their role is. Or during the meeting, they get completely lost on a topic and they're being polite, so they won't ask anybody to explain it more. In their head, they're playing a game of catch-up, going, if I just stay in this enough, somebody's going to throw me a bone long enough to understand how to unlock the jigsaw puzzle of this conversation. The expression on their face seems vague, and a lot of people are confused why they're participating in the meeting. When I look at our database in corporate context, the lost listener actually shows up the most. That 32% of the people in the database are represented by the lost listener. And if I could give one tip to a lost listener, please make sure you know why you're invited to the meeting and if the meeting's relevant to you. Otherwise, just decline the meeting and get the summary later on. The final villain of listening, and I'm going to predict, Ruben, that this is your listening villain. This listening villain is the shrewd listening villain. The shrewd listening villain disproportionately represented in the consulting professions, the technical professions, the brief-taking professions, lawyers, accountants, deeply, deeply overrepresented in software development, for example.
Uh-oh.
And the shrewd listener is listening really intently to the conversation. They're doing a beautiful job of nodding, providing non-verbal, I see what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
But in their head, they're just saying, oh, you think that's your problem? Hurry up. I want to solve that problem, but you don't realize there's 3 other problems you've got, and I can solve all of them. I'm awesome. And the shrewd listener isn't actually listening. They're solving the problem that the person's talking about. And while they're solving the problem, they're not listening. This is spectacularly well represented on a help desk where people jump scripted questions, for example, and assume they know the answer automatically to what somebody's presenting with, and then just wasting a whole bunch of time because they didn't listen fully. So the shrewd listener and the lost listener, definitely people who show up more in organizational context. Which one did you relate to, Ruben?
Sadly, I relate to all of them. I like to think that I'm getting better. I feel like the dramatic one is something that happens when you're hanging out with your friends and you're trying to, everyone's sharing their stories of whatever, and everyone wants to have the most exciting story. Definitely been guilty there. Interrupting listener, my kids would say I'm still very guilty of this, but I'm much, much better than I used to be. I used to be extremely impatient and wanted to short circuit everything. The lost listener, I definitely identify with. So many meetings and classes and just various situations where I'm like, or I realize that my mind has drifted off and I maybe I should have been paying attention, but oftentimes somebody said something interesting and it sparks this other train of thought in my head that pulls out of the station. And then by the time I realize it, I'm like, wait, what are they talking about again?
Yeah.
And then definitely guilty of the shrewd listener villain as well. I like to think I'm getting better there too. One of the things that I've noticed is as I've gotten older and maybe just more comfortable with myself, I feel like I can just show up, and my main goal is to understand. If I'm asking someone else questions, especially in a sales context or even in a personal context, it's like, I'm not trying to show anyone how smart I am the way I was in school or at the beginning of my career or whatever. It's like, I just want to get to know you first and then see what should happen next. And so, is it fair that I can be guilty of all four villainies at the same time, or in one person, but in different contexts?
In fact, you can be all four villains in one conversation.
That's probably happened too.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of us to know what good listening is to first know what bad listening is. And, for 2.5 years, I wrote about all the characteristics of what good listening is. And most of my engagement, whether that's through my newsletters or my social media or my podcast, was to say light at best would be an understatement. The day I wrote The Four Villains of Listening, the LinkedIn post went nuts. Nearly 9,500 people have seen that post now. It was shared by nearly 500 people. There were comments of nearly 1,000 comments. There were people tagging other people saying, isn't this like our boss, and tagging the person's name.
Right.
And I think people can relate to what's not working faster than what is working, which is a valuable lesson when it comes to sales. Too often we spend time jumping to the solution, where we need to spend much more time in understanding not just the spoken problem, but also what's unsaid, the unspoken problems as well. So the difference between a good listener and a deep listener is a deep listener understands this very simple rule. People speak at 125 words a minute. You can listen at up to 400 words a minute, and the speaker can think at up to 900 words a minute. So imagine this. I can think at 900 words a minute as a speaker, but my mouth can only allow me to get 125 to 150 words out every minute. So the likelihood that what I'm saying is what I'm thinking, or more importantly, what I'm meaning, there's kind of a 1 in 9 chance that that's what's true, or about 11%. So I don't know about you, Ruben, but if I went to a doctor and the doctor gave me an 11% chance of surviving a surgery, I'd probably get another opinion. Yet most of us don't ask the person we're listening to for their second and third opinion, because a lot of the time the first thing they say isn't what they're thinking. And you'll hear some amazing code words. So listen out for them if you ask this question, and tell me more. And what else? And just pause and silence for 30 seconds sometimes, and you'll hear these magic code words back, Ruben. And the code words are, you know what? Or they'll say, actually, you know what I should have said? I've just realized I've forgotten to tell you the most important thing. And when you get these code words coming ahead, you know that they're starting to speak about what they mean rather than the first thing that they say. So a really skillful listener will listen to what's unsaid to deconstruct for the speaker what they're thinking. The irony of deep listening is it's not for the listener. Listening exists so that the speaker can make sense of what they're saying. And if you understand that as a listener, listening becomes really easy, becomes really light, and it becomes all about them. Too many people, particularly people who are technically proficient, start off by asking why-based questions, where they should be asking how and what-based questions to begin with, because they're not in enough relationship to ask the tough why questions. The reason we try and make sure that why questions come in later is the first time you ever heard the word, why did you do that, Ruben, is when? Probably when your mother or your father caught you doing something at the age of 3, 4, 5, or 6, And it's triggering a really poor memory when people start to ask you why-based questions. In fact, whether it's FBI hostage negotiators or suicide counselors, they all say exactly the same thing. Ask more how-based questions to accelerate the relationship, and then they'll start to tell you what they really mean rather than putting up protective barriers.
Yeah, I'm so glad I haven't heard why did you do that, Ruben, since I was 3. It has never happened since, but it still has that vestigial memory in there.
Yeah, so, for those of you listening tomorrow, practice that simple tell me more. And what else? Or just a simple and with a long pause if you're in a good relationship with that person. Now, if you just go and do it 8 times in a row because you go, oh, well, mathematically, Oscar said there's a 1 in 9 chance I've got to find out the other 800 words in that person's head, you'll just get kicked out the door. So just skillfully using silence. None of us treat silence with the same reverence as if it was a word. None of us listen to silence completely, fully, and respectfully. And for a lot of the people we go and visit, whether they're customers or prospects, listening to the silence merely signals to the other person that what we're doing right now, I'm allowing you to think fully about what you're going to say next. It's done well in the East. It's done well in Korea. It's done well in Japan. It's done well in China. But in the West, we're in an urge to fill that space. And that's one tip we can get from the East and also from very ancient cultures like the Inuits of North America and the Maori and the Aboriginal communities of Australia and the Central African tribes. They use silence so well to explore what everybody's really thinking.
That's interesting. Something I noticed, I would be in meetings typically with older people when I was younger. I would get done talking and they wouldn't just right away. It's like they weren't in such a hurry. They would sometimes sort of scratch their chin or think about things, and they didn't feel compelled to immediately respond to whatever was in their head. And it's something that I've tried to do, and it's very liberating. Like when I started, there was almost like there was some kind of Olympic timer starting a stopwatch when the other person stopped. And if I didn't start talking right away, that meant I was stupid, was my fear, I think. Versus, I don't have to have an answer right now, right? If you go to the doctor, maybe they know exactly what's wrong with you, or maybe they don't. Maybe they're going to scratch their chin for a little bit, but you don't want them just talking for the sake of talking. You want them deliberating and doing the appropriate thing. And to your point, sometimes when I sit there scratching my chin, people say, you know what? Actually, right? Some of those code words or phrases that I've heard while I'm sitting there scratching my chin. I'm just noodling on their problem. I'm not even starting to think about what I should say yet. I'm just digesting what I've heard and letting them make sure they've got everything out that they need to get out. So let's talk a little bit about the 5 layers of meaning, because I think this is a useful framework for people. And like we discussed earlier, starting with you is really interesting and not something that I necessarily expected, but now that I understand it, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, so if we quickly run through and go, the 5 levels of listening are listening to yourself, listening to the content, listening for the context, listening for what's unsaid, and ultimately listening for meaning. Listening for meaning is the deepest level of listening, and it's for the speaker, not for you, so they can understand what they mean and they can make sense of what they're saying. Most listening literature actually starts at level 2.
Right.
Listening for the content, both what people say, what people are showing you with body language, for example. And a lot of the dialogue techniques that they teach are about helping the listener understand the speaker's content. And I'd say, although that's useful, it's not powerful, it's not potent, it's not productive. It's more important that the speaker understands what they're trying to make sense of than for you. If you can help them, that's fantastic. So level 1, just listen to yourself before you get into the conversation. So if you're distracted by electronic devices, liberate yourself and switch your phone into flight mode. Or if you're using an iPad to take notes or any other kind of electronic device, try and use the stylus rather than using a keypad. If you're using a keypad, you actually shut down the auditory cortex, the ability to listen, because most people type whilst saying the words they're trying to type in their head, and that shuts down the part of the brain that helps them to listen. Whereas if you're using a stylus, try and take visual notes. The neuroscience says you'll remember notes better if you try, even if you're a terrible artist. You've got kindergarten figures, stick figures to use them. Try and capture what the conversation means and maybe the actions rather than verbatim notes. If you're busy taking verbatim notes, again, you're shutting down the part of the brain that can actually listen. So it's really important. Drink water. That will slow you down. Make sure whoever you're in a meeting with, they have water too. And if they're drinking coffee, if they've just brought in a Starbucks, make sure they have an extra glass of water to kind of help them as well. And then the final thing, just notice your breathing. And in noticing yours, and you've slowed it down a bit and it's a little bit deeper, see if you can notice their breathing. If you can notice their breathing, you'll tend to help them to synchronize the breathing state of the room to a deeper breathing. And when the room breathes at a deeper level, the thinking happens at a deeper level, the questioning happens at a deeper level. And although it may feel like it takes a little bit longer at the beginning of the meeting, the outcomes will be much better and more productive, probably not even by the end of the meeting. So that's level 1, listen to yourself. So those 3 tips: breathe deeply, remove the digital distractions, and hydrate, drink water. Level 2, listen to the content. Most people think it's the words, and that's true. But you also need to listen to 2 other things, what they're giving you back as body language and also what they're giving you back as energy, which is not always their body language. It's not always how they're holding their shoulders, but you can notice their state. I remember working with a client and we were going through a very complex discussion. They had some systemic issues with regulators outside of their organization. They had some issues in the global audit team that were coming down to the organization. And I was exploring with them with a series of really simple questions that help them to get to those 900 words faster. By the way, Ruben, here's also a good tip. If you're asking questions that are more than 7 words long, you're probably not asking a question. You're probably making a statement that's got a question mark around it.
Like I've been doing on this interview.
Yeah, but this is a conversation. It's just not so much a diagnostic dialogue as we would with our prospects and our clients. And you can see the shift in their energy. Sometimes it comes from their eyes. Sometimes it comes from their spine becoming more erect and their shoulders go back, or sometimes they slouch forward. And you can see this state change. And the important thing about listening to the content at that level is to get them to notice it. So in that moment, I said to this CEO, "What just happened for you?" He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Your state's just changed." And he said, "Oh, I didn't even notice." Because most people are so stuck in their own head, they don't realize they're part of a system of a whole human and a body. And they said, "Well, I'm glad you pointed that out. I've just realized something I've missed completely. There's a new relationship I haven't even developed that's going to cost me a lot if I don't sort it out now." Now, in that moment, if I didn't ask them to notice their state change, they would have just moved on and continued the dialogue. So again, helping them to listen to their state change is really potent. Now, these first 2 levels of listening, we're listening to things. We're listening to ourselves and we're listening to the content. If you imagine a line now, an imaginary line we're just crossing, from now on, we're listening for things.
Okay.
So we're helping them listen for the context. So I'm going to put this in a sales context. Most good salespeople try and beat the competition, and good salespeople understand the context of what they need to sell into from a business case point of view. So it's not enough to beat the competition. I had a client in New Zealand last quarter of the year selling contact center software to a big New Zealand organization. They were the selected vendor, but they didn't get the purchase order because they lost to Kimberly-Clark, a company that sells diapers and toilet paper. And they did so because they made an offer to the CFO. If they bought a full year's order worth of toilet paper, they'd give them a 50% discount. So they weren't really listening to a really simple question that I often get people to explore the context as it relates to a business case. If the finance team was part of this discussion, what questions would they be asking us that we haven't asked each other? And in that exploration, as you listen to what they say, and then you say, and anything else, tell me more about that, they'll start to explain to you how a business case gets socialized in their organization. If the owner signs it off, or if the CEO signs it off, or if there's a procurement committee and all these things, a lot of us don't listen to the context beyond the content. Another way to listen for the context is, does the person always speak in the past, or do they speak in the future? Do they speak in detail? Do they speak in big picture? If you're listening for their context and their backstory, it becomes really simple to make them more effective there.
Now, what should we learn from past, future, and big picture detail?
What you want to do is make sure that you're communicating with them in a way that's matched to suit them, rather than in a way that's your preference.
Got it.
Too many technical experts love to speak in the detail, and that works fine if you're speaking to people who love the detail. But most of us aren't even conscious that we're speaking to a big picture person. They might prefer frameworks and models to sequence, detail, and next steps. So always when you're noticing somebody speaks to the bigger picture, make sure you confirm where your solution or how their problem sets relates to the bigger picture, and then just explore, would it be useful for me to explain how we might roll that out, what the sequence might be. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, just touch lightly on the big bullets, which is already saying I'm not interested in the detail, but I'm interested enough. Or, no, don't worry, we have a project team that looks after that. We can move on. Yeah?
Yeah, I've screwed that up so many times. Too much detail in many cases.
Yeah, and a lot of it's just to pause in the dialogue and go, if I'm noticing this, they're speaking about the big picture consistently. And typically the big picture will connect to externalities, competitors, customers, regulators, global industry trends, and you need to keep the elevation of the conversation there. A simple question to always ask is, who would be involved in selecting the kinds of solutions we're talking about today? And then simply ask again, and is there anybody else? So make sure you're covering off risk, and you're covering off legal, and you're covering off procurement, and you're covering off finance, and all those ones that larger organizations have. And then in owner-run businesses, what competing priorities do you think your owner would have for this? Because, they might need to make payroll that month. They might need to put a mortgage payment on their house, or they might be looking to acquire another company. But most of us don't take the time to listen there.
That's a great point. Go ahead.
The last two levels, listening to the unsaid is the ultimate listening ninja move. It comes back to what we talked about earlier on, the 125-400 rule. They speak at 125, you listen at 400 words a minute, but they can think it up to 900 words a minute. So the most productive thing, the most useful thing, the thing that's going to make the biggest difference for the relationship and the sale is to help them speak fully about what they do. I enjoy a great working relationship with the washing machine in our house, Ruben. I help out with the washing. Now, here's one thing I noticed. A human needs a rinse cycle. It's called talking. And a washing machine requires at least 2 rinse cycles. If you've ever opened the lid when a washing machine's on wash cycle, it's pretty sudsy, it's pretty dirty, and it doesn't really make sense. Some of it looks like clothes and some of it looks like dirty water, and that's what's happening in most people's brains when you ask them questions about complex topics that you're an expert in. They haven't spent as much time understanding what that topic is and verbalizing it. And just because you're an expert in the solution, the thing that most experts don't take enough time to do is spend more time listening to the problem than offering the solution. Here's a simple rule of sales I learnt from two great Scottish salespeople 10 years ago and 20 years ago. They said to me, Oscar, if you can explain their problem to them better than they can, it doesn't matter what you sell, they think you've got the answer.
Right.
So I'll say that again. If you can explain their problem to them better than they can, they think you've got the solution. So not enough of us spend enough time in understanding the details of the problem because we're trying to be too smart and get to the solution. We actually slow the sales cycle down if we don't spend enough time exploring the problem set.
I have done that so many times too.
And it's both the problem that the customer or prospect is presenting with, as well as the problem of how do they socialize the process of buying what you want to sell them as well. So too many of us solve the first problem, whereas we need to be equally listening to the second problem. How do we sell the business case? How do we help them be successful in making the sale? The last level of listening is listening for meaning. And when we listen for meaning, doors unlock so much faster. I was working with a global pharmaceutical company. I was presenting to a group of 35, 36 people managers in a room about the topic of listening. And at about the 30-minute mark, I just noticed the energy in the room was different. There just wasn't. I was listening at level 2. I was listening for energy, and the CEO of this pharmaceutical company was just a stage right, and I was in center stage with a handheld microphone. And I turned to him and I said, hey, I'm going to try something different. Do you trust me? And he said, do I have a choice? And I said, yeah, you do. I want to respect you in the room. He says, sure, go ahead. And I asked the room, hey guys, just turn to the person next to you. If we were to describe what's happening in the last week here on this manufacturing site for this pharmaceutical company, what movie would it be? Have a chat to the person next to you. And the energy in the room changed immediately. There was so much noise and everybody was laughing and giggling and brought the room back. And I said, okay, so what movies are we hearing? And we were hearing disaster movies. We were hearing Die Hard. We were hearing Titanic. We were hearing Towering Inferno.
Wow.
And when you ask people to explore their meaning, you're giving them permission to tell the truth. They would never have said that to the CEO at the side of the stage. Now, what happened next was the most powerful part of this story. What happened next was he gave me these kind of laser superhero villain, his eyes into my eyes, kind of going, how could you do this to me? And he walked up on stage and took the microphone off me, and I thought, oh, well, don't think I'm going to get paid for this. And he stood up and he said to the room something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. He said, I'm really sorry. I don't want people to come to work every day thinking they're working in a disaster. I can't solve this by myself. Can you help me? And the room and the tension in the room was completely gone. What I learned later, for 3 months, they'd had a problem with one of the pipes in the manufacturing process that meant that millions of dollars of stock was stuck in quality assurance because they weren't sure if it would pass the quality assurance test. And in asking for help, they solved that problem in 3 days that had been lingering for 3 months. And the reason they were able to solve that, A, because of the disaster movie conversation, but the conversation they had next, and I said to them simply, guys, I'm going to step out and leave you guys to it because I think what you guys need to have a discussion right now is who aren't you listening to? And that will help unlock. And the room, almost as one, as I learned later on, said they were spending too much time listening to risk and compliance, to engineers, to people who dealt with regulators, and they needed to listen to the people on the production line. And when they went and listened to the people on the production line for a day, they, on the production line, gave them the solution the next day, and they implemented the solution the following day. So something that had been going on for months was solved in 3 days because they listened. But because I helped them listen and make sense of their own meaning, it gave them permission to say to the boss, hey, boss, a bit of a disaster going on here. And to his credit, he said, I don't know how to solve this. Can you help me? So he was willing to listen as well. So that's the highest level of listening for meaning. But it's not the meaning you make of what they say. It's the meaning they make of what they say that's really important.
That's a great story. I think it kind of highlights something that's a problem. I realized when I'm talking about some of the mistakes I've made, a lot of it was just insecurity, right? I want to show someone that I'm smart or not look like I'm stupid, and in the process usually achieve the opposite result. But and then when we're talking to people in a sales context, they're often feeling insecure and worried about looking stupid. Like, here's the expert and they're screwing up their whatever, whether it's their pharmaceutical production or their website or something. Like, the reason they're talking to you is they know that they can't solve this problem on their own. But it's hard, especially when you don't feel comfortable. Not only you don't know the topic, but you have to sort of admit that you're screwing this up somehow, which often leads to people not saying what they really mean. Kind of going back to your what's unsaid, right? They're not comfortable really surfacing how badly they might be screwing this up until they trust that you're not going to whack them emotionally for being such an idiot kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think if you're listening deeply as kind of a technical expert, if you think about it from a technical perspective, say, technology orientation, one of the most potent things you can do to listen to your customers is go and listen to your top 10 help desk tickets. All your sales are going to be in there. If you can solve those are real problems that customers have got, you can either build products out of that, you can create education around that, but that's a beautiful pipeline of untapped opportunities that most people don't look at. If you're a technical expert in a consulting profession, if you went back and looked over your last 10, 20, 30 assignments and said, what do all these things have in common? Where is the repeatable issues in here? Again, the problem sets that the customers are describing are evident in your assignments. And you could do a wonderful job of talking to new and existing clients by just saying, hey, kinds of assignments I've been working on are problem set A and problem set B and problem set C. So not your solution, but the problems that the customers are using in the customer's language. Again, you're going to have an amazing funnel of opportunities that you never considered because you're not listening to the problem sets in the most simple way. So hopefully that helps people access the potency of listening, because help desk tickets or a summary of the last 10 to 20 consulting assignments is really going to be the edges of the jigsaw puzzle that starts to fill in the next set of revenue for you.
That's a great tip. And you can do the same thing with your sales calls, right? When people are describing what I really need to fix is blah, right? They're about to describe what their real problem is. And it's probably not going to be the exact words that you use on your website to describe the solution.
Yeah, and sometimes we are set up beautifully to solve that, but sometimes the most potent thing you can do is to simply refer them to an organization that can solve that problem. I tell a funny story. There's somebody who I referred very early on in my consulting journey. He has probably referred me to 25, maybe 30 organizations that I've worked with. Every year I send him a card, which is on the anniversary of when we met and I referred to somebody else, and he's never transacted with me once. And I never really understood why he kept referring business to me. Now, the tragedy would have been if I tried to sell him something and was successful, because no matter what I sold him, I could never have made as much money as all the clients he's referred me to. And 2 years ago, I took him out as a lunch as a thank you. And I just said to Ian, I said, I'm curious why you referred me. He said, you made it so clear not only what you do, but what you didn't do. So it made you very easy to refer to other people. And I was confident that if you had the courage to say, I'm not the right person to help Ian out, you'd also tell the truth to anybody I referred you to. And yeah, probably in a third of cases of people he's referred me to, I'm not the right person. But I think too often we get caught up in trying to solve the problem with our solution sometimes the most honourable and effective thing we could do is refer them to someone who can solve it faster and better for them.
That's a great point. And as I've mentioned before on the podcast, my wife being a doctor is sort of a good role model for me in a lot of cases, because if she's got a patient with the right stuff, she's the person to go solve that. But if it's the wrong organ or the wrong situation, she knows that she shouldn't be going around in there and fiddling with things that aren't her specialty. She refers that to somebody who specializes in that.
Yeah. So that's the 5 levels of listening. Most people get stuck in our database. 86% of people are stuck at listening to yourself. Most people are distracted because they've got devices and all kinds of buzz and ding happening around them, and they're not focused on the person they're going into the conversation. And the same is true whether you're doing this on the phone or you're doing this via webinar as well. The same principles apply. People say to me, oh, well, that's all nice for you, Oscar, face-to-face meetings, but I have to do it over the phone. So one of the things I would always say, if you're listening deeply on the phone, you can not only notice what they're saying, you can notice what they're not saying, you can notice their breathing, you can notice how engaged they are with you based on simply how close they are to the microphone, whether they're speaking on a phone or a headset, because if they're turning away or they're typing, their head's in a completely different position than if they're looking up and visually thinking that they're talking to you as well. So these techniques apply just as well, either into virtual environments where you're lucky enough to have a video view of them, as well as audio as well. And for the parents out there, here's a tip. If you travel and you're talking to your children, if it's on FaceTime or only via audio, always make sure your head is at the same level as your child's head. In a lot of cases, that might mean you need to sit down or squat down while you're talking to your children, but it brings you to a place and a space that helps you listen to the way they are in that moment. Too many of us might be in a hotel room and pace around, which a lot of my clients tell me they're guilty of. But if you're talking to your children, just make sure you're at their eye level. When the same is true for face-to-face, if you're not good at squatting, or please don't lean down. You want to make sure you bring your child up so that your eye level and their eye level is at the same position, and you're role modeling great listening to them. But more importantly, you'll start to notice things differently when you see their whole face rather than looking at them from above.
That's a great point. And kids are great at providing feedback on this kind of stuff. They don't have the sort of the social skills of hiding what you might hide in a corporate environment. Even if you're really annoyed with somebody, they'll just kind of make it very clear that you're not paying attention to them and you should really listen carefully. Or, Dad, you don't get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I heard a beautiful story from when I was speaking off stage, and somebody came up to me and said, oh, you must have been in the car yesterday when I picked up my 3-year-old, because she said to me, Mummy, you're bumping my words, which was her way of saying you're interrupting me.
Right. That's a good one. So first of all, if you haven't read Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, you should get it. It's a quick read, but it is life-changing. Other than that, what should people do next to become better listeners?
Very simply, switch off those devices when those conversations that matter. And if you're calling somebody and you've got a screen in front of you, just minimize the browser windows in your mind as well as on the screen. Try and switch your screen off so you're not distracted while you're having the conversations with people. And then if you are traveling to see the client face-to-face, or if you're not, if you're sitting in a chair and you're just about to call them, just take a moment to breathe in deeply for 3 deep breaths, in through your nose and out through your mouth, and that will get you into a state and a place that will prepare you to help them to listen to themselves. If you love what we're doing, the Deep Listening podcast series, we interview professional listeners like journalists, high court judges, air traffic controllers for their tips, tricks and hacks about how they listen well, as well as personal listeners. And that could be a suicide counsellor, that could be a palliative care nurse, or that could be a deaf interpreter or a foreign language interpreter. And they all provide a great perspective on how to listen deeply.
Well, thanks so much, Oscar. This has been super helpful for me. And I think it's something that obviously has a great applicability in the corporate context, but also just in life in general. It's always good if you can actually listen to what people around you that you care about are saying.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Thanks.
Have a friend who'd benefit from this episode? Pass the word along. Have a friend who wouldn't benefit from this episode, but you haven't talked to in a while? Give them a call. Of course, iTunes reviews are great for getting the word out and also for helping me make the show that you want. So if you've got topics or guests that you want discussed on the podcast or in the apparently upcoming Sales for Nerds book, let me know. And if you want to automate client acquisition, turning more web visitors into leads into conversations and onto closed deals, while helping you stay in touch with the people who matter, check out Mimiran.com. That's www.mimiran.com. And once again, thanks for listening.